At 2:22 a.m. local time, the most important weapon in these ceasefire talks wasn't a missile, a drone, or a naval patrol. It was a single word: trust. According to the BBC headline you're seeing tonight, the Iranian delegation leader says the United States failed to gain Iran's trust during the talks. That is not a throwaway complaint. In ceasefire diplomacy, trust is not an emotion. It is a strategic currency. And when one side publicly declares that trust failed, it usually means one of two things is happening behind the scenes. Either the framework is genuinely unraveling, or one side is deliberately setting the conditions to blame the other if it collapses. Both possibilities are dangerous. Because ceasefires don't fail only when bombs fall. They fail when the incentives to hold the ceasefire become weaker than the incentives to accuse the other side of violating it. The second, trust, becomes a public issue. Every incident becomes a test. Every definition becomes a weapon. And every side front becomes a potential trigger. And in this war, a multi-front, multi-actor, saturated with proxy dynamics and maritime risk, trust isn't a nice-to-have. It's the thin layer of glue holding together a framework that otherwise breaks under the weight of competing objectives. So tonight, I'm going to tell you what this actually means. Not the headline meaning, the strategic meaning. It means Iran is signaling that the talks did not produce the one outcome that matters most at the start of any ceasefire process. Credible assurance that the other side will do what it says. It means the ceasefire window, if it exists, may be moving from pause construction into violation pretext. It means both sides may now be preparing their narrative exits. Because if a deal collapses, the first battle is not military. The first battle is political. Who gets blamed? And it means the next 48 hours could be more dangerous than the last week. Because once trust collapses in public, the system begins behaving as if escalation is coming, whether leaders want it or not. Let's start with the basics. Why trust is not diplomacy language, it's operational language. When negotiators talk about trust, they're talking about three technical things. First, sequencing. Who acts first? Who pauses first? Who opens what first? Who withdraws what first? If there is no trust, nobody wants to move first. And if nobody moves first, the ceasefire never starts. Second, verification. How do you confirm compliance? If there is no trust, verification demands increase. But the more verification you demand, the more the other side feels coerced or humiliated, and the talks can collapse for that reason too. Third, consequences. What happens when something goes wrong? Because something always goes wrong. If there is no trust, both sides insist on the right to retaliate quickly, meaning the ceasefire becomes a hair-trigger mechanism rather than a stabilizing one. So when Iran's delegation leader says the U.S. failed to gain trust, the signal is that one or more of those three components, sequencing, verification, consequences, was not accepted as credible. That is not, we didn't like their tone. That is, we don't believe the mechanism protects our interests. Now, here's the part most people miss. A public trust complaint is also a positioning move. If talks break down, Iran wants the world to believe, we tried. They didn't respect the process. They weren't credible. The United States will want the world to believe. We offered a path. They stalled. They played for time. They refused reasonable terms. This is the pre-blame phase. It often arrives right before escalation resumes because both sides are building domestic and international permission structures for what comes next. That is why this headline matters. Why Pakistan talks become a pressure chamber. When talks are held in a place like Pakistan, the point is usually to reduce political toxicity and create a channel for workable compromise. Pakistan provides distance from immediate front lines, regional credibility, and the ability to pass messages quickly. But that also means something else. When the talks struggle, there is less space to hide. A delegation leader declaring no trust right after talks is a sign the channel is either being used to salvage terms at the last minute or being used to document failure. And both scenarios produce pressure, because pressure is what diplomacy becomes when time is short. Now, if you want to understand what likely happened inside those talks, without pretending we have classified readouts, you focus on the only thing that consistently produces trust failure outcomes in these conflicts: the definition fight. The definition fight. What counts as stopping? A ceasefire is not one promise. It's a stack of promises. One side wants strikes to stop. The other wants sanctions pressure eased. One side wants maritime access guaranteed. The other wants surveillance and posture reduced. One side wants proxies restrained. The other wants proxies redefined as independent actors. These stacks collapse on definitions, because definitions decide who is allowed to keep pressure tools active while claiming compliance. If Iran says trust failed, the most likely underlying reality is that Iran believes the U.S. position still leaves Washington with freedom of action to strike or pressure, while restricting Iran's ability to respond without being labeled the violator. In other words, Iran fears a one-sided ceasefire architecture. You pause when we say, and we reserve the right to punish you if something happens. The U.S. fears the opposite, A ceasefire that gives Iran time to reposition, resupply, and keep pressure active through proxies while the U.S. is politically constrained by the ceasefire. Both fears can be true at the same time. That's what makes this so hard. Why trust collapses first in multi-front wars? This is not a two-actor conflict with one line of contact. It's a network war. Different fronts, different actors, different escalation speeds. Even if Washington and Tehran agree, the edges can still burn. A side front strike, a proxy incident, a maritime scare, a cyber disruption, a domestic political shock. And the moment any edge burns, both sides can claim the other is acting in bad faith. That is where trust becomes operational. In a multi-front system, a ceasefire has to manage not only the center, but the edges. If it cannot manage the edges, it cannot manage the center for long. So the question becomes, did the talks produce an edge control mechanism, a hotline, a deconfliction layer, a verification process, a rapid dispute resolution channel? If not, then a trust failure statement is the first sign the negotiators know the ceasefire would collapse under the first shock. And that brings us to the next layer. Incentives. Incentives. Why both sides may still want a ceasefire and still sabotage it. This is the uncomfortable truth of war termination. A side can want the war to stop being expensive and still want the war to stop on terms that protect deterrence. Those two goals are not always compatible. The U.S. wants stability without looking coerced. Iran wants relief without looking broken. If the talks produce a framework that looks like Iran accepted pressure, Tehran will reject it publicly or poison it quietly. If the talks produce a framework that looks like U.S. backed off first, Washington will face domestic and allied pressure and may harden its terms. So trust can fail because the substance is unacceptable, but it can also fail because the optics are unacceptable. In modern conflict, optics are not decoration. They determine whether leaders have political space to comply. Now let's talk about the one domain that magnifies all of this: maritime and economic risk, Hormuz and the global consequence problem. Even if the talks are about a ceasefire, the global system is watching one thing: shipping risk and oil prices. If talks fail, the fastest way for the war to become a global crisis is through maritime uncertainty. You do not need a full closure. You need enough perceived risk that insurers raise premiums, shippers reroute, and markets spike. That is why trust matters so much. Markets don't need perfect peace. They need predictable rules. When negotiators say no trust, markets interpret it as no predictable rule set. So a trust failure headline can produce real-world effects: higher security posture in the Gulf, elevated maritime escorts, increased force protection, more aggressive, signaling higher market volatility, even before the first new strike occurs. That is how wars escalate in the modern era. The system shifts first. The explosions come later. Defense math: why stalling is leverage and why both sides fear it. Here's the defense math that sits behind these talks. Maintaining stability is expensive. Interceptors patrol hours, ISR flights, naval escorts readiness cycles, political attention. Creating uncertainty can be cheaper. Timed threats, limited incidents, proxy, pressure, ambiguous actions. This is why the U.S. is highly sensitive to being played. If Iran can stretch talks while keeping pressure tools active indirectly, Iran gains leverage because the U.S. and its partners pay the cost of constant readiness. Iran has the mirror fear. If the U.S. can keep a ceasefire framework that still allows selective strikes or pressure, Iran feels trapped, unable to respond without violating, while the U.S. retains coercive freedom. So both sides fear asymmetry. Both sides call it trust. That is why trust fails. Now, what happens next depends on which of three tracks this headline represents. Track 1, real collapse. Talks genuinely failed, and both sides are now preparing to exit diplomatically and resume pressure. If this is true, you will see threat language, rising force, posture hardening, blame framing, intensifying less procedural language, more consequence language. Track 2, negotiation tactic. Iran is using trust failure as leverage to force concessions, publicly raising the cost of non-compromise for Washington. If this is true, you will see continued private contact, mixed public messaging, harsh in public, procedural and back channels, last-minute clarifications of terms. Track 3, controlled ambiguity. Both sides want the talks to continue, but neither wants to own the responsibility for the pause. Trust failure becomes a way to slow expectations while keeping the channel alive. If this is true, you will see fewer definitive statements, emphasis on ongoing discussions, limited, measured actions designed to avoid full collapse. All three are possible. The question is, which signals appear next? The ceasefire in danger mechanism. A ceasefire framework becomes fragile when one side publicly declares distrust because it raises the probability of the following chain reaction. Side incident occurs, real or alleged, immediate blame follows. We warned you, we couldn't trust them. Retaliatory action is justified. Opposing side responds, ceasefire becomes a historical footnote. This is how fragile ceasefires die. Not from one action alone, but from a pre-built narrative that makes retaliation politically easy. So the headline is dangerous not because it proves the ceasefire is dead. It is dangerous because it makes the ceasefire easier to kill. And what Washington is likely doing right now, if Washington wants to keep a ceasefire alive after a public trust complaint, it has to do two things simultaneously. Maintain enough pressure that Iran cannot use the trust narrative to extract unlimited concessions. Maintain enough procedural discipline that the channel does not collapse into threat-only messaging. That usually means controlled public statements, quiet back-channel engagement, emphasis on verification and sequencing, attempts to isolate sidefront incidences. Washington will likely avoid language that locks it into an irreversible posture, because once irreversible language is used, compromise becomes politically impossible. What Tehran is likely doing right now, Iran, after issuing a trust failure signal, has to preserve two options. Keep the channel open. If concessions appear possible, preserve the right to escalate if it concludes the U.S. is not credible. That usually means harsh public language paired with private engagement, increased emphasis on red lines posture, signaling without immediate maximum escalation. If Iran wants leverage without collapse, it will try to keep actions ambiguous and reversible. If it wants to collapse the ceasefire, it will move toward clearer, attributed steps. The spoiler danger around talks. Whenever talks happen, spoilers move. Spoilers can be proxy actors, side front commanders, political factions, third parties who benefit from continued war. A spoiler doesn't need to create a strategic victory. It needs to create a political trap, an incident so emotionally toxic that leaders cannot continue talks without looking weak. This is why the period immediately after a trust failure statement is one of the most sensitive times in a negotiation cycle. It increases the payoff of spoiler action because both sides are already primed to interpret incidents as bad faith. What happens next? A watch list. If you want to know whether the ceasefire is salvageable or collapsing, watch these signals over the next 24-72 hours. Watch. 1. Language shift. Do officials shift toward procedural language, framework, verification, sequencing, monitoring, or toward threat language, retaliation, consequences, no more patience? Procedural language means talks are alive. Threat language means the exit ramps are being built. Watch 2. Tempo of operations. Does the battlefield quiet slightly, even if imperfectly? Or does tempo spike? Ceasefires often survive their first dispute if tempo drops afterward. They rarely survive if the dispute becomes the start of a sequence. Watch 3. Maritime behavior. Do shipping patterns calm? Do insurers soften? Do escorts reduce? Markets are often the first to indicate whether trust exists. Watch 4. Sidefront discipline. Do proxy and sidefront incidents decrease or flare? Discipline suggests command and control and political intent to hold. Flares suggest spoiler activity or deliberate leverage. Watch 5. Backchannel continuity. Do you hear wording like contacts continue, technical teams, working groups, next meeting? If those disappear, the collapse is real. Watch 6. Verification mechanisms. Any mention of monitoring, observers, hotlines, deconfliction indicates the architecture is being built. Without architecture, trust cannot be repaired. Bottom line, the headline, U.S. failed to gain Iran's trust, is not a commentary on feelings. It is a strategic signal that the ceasefire architecture, definitions, sequencing, verification, consequences, is under stress. In one line, if trust is publicly declared broken, the ceasefire becomes vulnerable to the next incident, because now both sides have permission to escalate while claiming they were forced. This does not guarantee collapse, but it changes the system. It shifts the incentive landscape. It makes the next 48 hours more dangerous. Watch whether the language turns procedural or punitive. Watch whether maritime risk calms or rises. Watch whether side fronts quiet or flare. Those are the indicators that tell you whether this is a negotiation tactic, controlled ambiguity, or the first public step toward restarting the pressure cycle. Because in wars like this, ceasefires don't end in one dramatic moment. They end in a sequence of blame, a sequence of incidents, and a sequence of decisions that become easier once the word trust has already been declared dead.